some statistics that may or may not surprise you. But Stu has a list of the states that are doing the best right now with COVID, and also states that are doing the worst.
And I would say this is a look at the entire year, right? So it's not just where they are.
It's not right now.
Moment.
It's
how do they do over the past year?
Yeah.
And so we went through, did a formula there. Let me give you some of the factors that went into this. Mm-hmm. One, obviously, how well did you avoid people dying in your state? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, that's obviously a big factor. But number two, I mean, this because we hear from the news media is trying to compare death totals and everything else. We also looked at the economy. How well were you be able to protect the economy through this?
Okay,
it was a really difficult thing for states to do. Some states did a lot better than others. We also looked at what is from there's an University of Oxford Stringency Index, which is basically a measure of how hard the government cracked down. How long did they put the people into relative shutdown levels, right? Did they have a light touch? Did they have a heavy touch when it comes to that? And I think that's somewhat controversial in that, like, people would say, well, what does that matter? I think, like, if you have two states that had the same results with the economy and deaths, right? But one gave you complete freedom, the other one locked you down in individual plastic bubbles.
That matters.
Yeah, that matters, right? I mean, free. Mm-hmm. It's the United States of America here. So I use that as a factor. Those are the three biggest factors. However, there's also, we factored in the age of the population. So a state that has an older population should get a break in comparing the death rate, to a state that has a younger population. Same thing with density. If you have a state with a population density that's high. We looked at vaccine rollout, all sorts of different things, and kind of came up with a final score 0 to 100 for all 50 states. So let me give you some of the bottom states. I'll start seventh from the bottom for a reason, because it was California. Score of 35.7 out of 100. They actually didn't do terribly as far as the rate of COVID, but as we point out, they have a relatively young population in California. So that does make a difference as far as the death rate, but we factored that in. They finished seventh from the bottom. Sixth from the bottom was Massachusetts, 28.1 out of 100. Fifth from the bottom, Connecticut, our old home state, Pat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, can you blame some of its neighbors for this? I think you could.
Yes.
But Connecticut also didn't do all that well. Rhode Island is fourth from the bottom. 25.2 is the score out of 100. Third from the bottom, red state, Louisiana. 20.6 out of 100. Now, you can probably fairly note that part of the reason Louisiana had a really bad outbreak of COVID was
Mardi Gras.
Mm-hmm. Which happened at the end of February last year, and of course was held in a very blue area of Louisiana, not a very red area of Louisiana. But, as long as you have New Orleans in your state, you're responsible for it, Louisiana. I apologize for that, but I didn't put it in your state. That was your thing. So you're responsible for the outbreak in New Orleans. So they came out third to worst, 20.6 out of 100. Then there's quite a drop off from third to worst at 20.6 to second to worst. New Mexico, 7.9 out of 100.
Wow.
So from 20.6 to 7.9. People don't realize that New Mexico had the hardest lockdown in the nation. Harder than any other state. California, New York, nobody locked down harder than New Mexico.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. They had their economy was a disaster as well. They didn't even get good results as far as COVID. They didn't do anything well throughout this entire process. So New Mexico finishes second to last, and in dead last place, without anyone's surprise, of course, is New York with a score of 6.8 out of 100. They had the second strongest lockdown in the country. Despite that, had the second worst COVID numbers, only to New Jersey, which is completely New York's fault anyway. Mm-hmm. And also their economy was a disaster. Despite the fact they have a giant industry there that could work from home, they still couldn't protect the economy at all. So they finish in dead last place. Of course, Andrew Cuomo is awful.com should be noted at this time. Shall we give you some of the top top picks?
Yeah. Who did the best?
Let's see. All right. Well, who did the best?
And we're starting at...
9, 10. Let me give you 10.
All right.
Alaska, number 10, score of 66.7. Again, we take into account population density. But again, there's some asterisks in this. Like Hawaii, what do you do with... Hawaii obviously is going to have a really good result on COVID because they're an island, but also a really bad result on the economy because they're dependent on flights.
Yeah.
So it's a tough one to measure, but Alaska came in 10th, South Dakota in 9th. And I think a lot of people would think South Dakota would do really well on this. They were number 2 on the stringency index. So it's the second least amount of time in lockdown. But they're 44th as far as COVID per million. So that hurt them. Like they had a very open attitude towards this, which I respect, and I like Kristi Noem quite a bit. But look, they just had a really rough battle with that when it comes to their rates. 8th place, Nebraska, 67.8 out of 100. Then Virginia actually did pretty well. In 7th place, 68.9. Iowa in 6th place, 69.9 out of 100. Iowa, another one that they had that initial shutdown period and then were pretty open after that and had relatively good results, certainly good economic results. Number 5, Oregon.
That's a surprise.
That one is a surprise to me. And I was thinking about this because the score is 70.1 out of 100 for Oregon. Again, best COVID results by state for the entire year. They had very low rates of COVID, but they locked down. I mean, they were middle of the pack when it comes down to how long they locked down. My theories on this was, one, Portland in particular was burning down most of the year, so probably people were terrified to go outdoors at all and see anyone. Plus, you also have and their economy did relatively well compared to some of these other more lockdown type states. And I think you might have a population that was more able to work from home. The industries there are friendlier to being able to work at home, so there wasn't as much of a need for that. But that's where that finished. Number 4, Idaho, 74.1 score out of 100. Idaho did pretty much everything pretty well. Every one of their categories was pretty good. Not at the top of the list, but in the top third on pretty much every single thing. A couple of surprises here towards the top here. Number 3, and there's an asterisk on this one a little bit too. Number 3 was Wisconsin. And I would think Wisconsin, how the heck, really? They have a Democratic governor, yet they ranked on this, how long did they lock down the stringency index? They were only 5th. They were somehow 5th. Now, I looked into that a little bit more, thinking, how the hell did Wisconsin finish 5th in this measure? Because it's really the strongest thing that they had going for them in this, in the little formula here. And the reason was the courts kept overturning all the things the Democratic governor wanted to do. So they never, they were on and off again a little bit, but the courts were like, no, you can't do any of this crap. So they didn't go into lockdown as much as a lot of other blue states did, which is kind of an interesting factor. Score of 83.9 out of 100. Number 2, New Hampshire, 84.9 out of 100.
Wouldn't have guessed that one either.
Yeah, I wouldn't have either. Although you got live free or die, right?
Yeah.
They did not lock down all that hard. They had pretty good results from COVID, and their economy was relatively well protected. They are also an older population, which helps them in this measure. I mean, considering they were 8th overall in death rate and had the second oldest population in the country, it's pretty impressive that stuck together. And it kind of makes sense in some ways. It's a state that has a motto where you're supposed to be taking responsibility for your own actions, and maybe that helped play in. Number 1, though, are you ready? Score of 90.1 out of 100.
I am.
90.1 out of 100, the number 1 score in the entire union. This was a surprise to me. I will say I didn't see this one coming. Number 1, the state of... Does this end or
confusion? The state of confusion? No. Okay. The state of
Utah.
That is what I was going to guess.
Really?
Yeah. That's what I was going to guess.
That's pretty interesting to me. I would not have guessed it.
Really?
Just because I don't know. I mean, it didn't get any press.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like
No,
people
it
talk,
really didn't.
the right has talked about Texas. They've talked about Florida. They talked about Arizona.
Dakota.
They talked about South Dakota. They've talked about a lot of different states. Georgia got press at the beginning quite a bit. You know, really, I haven't heard much conversation about Utah, but Utah kind of sat there and did incredibly well in every measure here. Number 3, as far as how long were they in lockdown? 3rd least amount of time. So they were 3rd, say, on the Freedom Index, right?
Okay.
Economy, they finished 7th in the entire country.
Mm-hmm.
And their COVID results, they finished 6th.
Wow.
So really now I will say they are the youngest state in the union, which I did not know either until doing this research. Youngest state in the union. However, that they get punished in this measure for that. Like if you're a young state, you lose points on the formula because you shouldn't. An older state has a tougher time with something like this.
Yeah.
So even despite the fact that they got punished for that, still finished number 1 in the union with a score of 90.1.
Wow.
And really has had no press and no credit and no love. I mean, I haven't heard anybody saying, wow, who's doing a good job is Utah. And this comes back to something I think has proved since the beginning of this to be really important. We've talked so much about what the government does. Am I going to sit here and say that everything that Utah did from the government level was right? I doubt it. I mean, I don't know all the details. I don't live in Utah, but I guarantee if we open up the phone lines, we get lots of people complaining about what the government was saying or doing in Utah, as we would from every state. But there's something to do with this coming back to, instead of the government, the people. This is the United States of America. We lead the government. The government doesn't lead us. That's not the way this works. And if you look at the type of population you'd want to potentially have in the time of a pandemic, I gotta say you might draft Mormons number 1. You might. First of all, they're pretty healthy. Mm-hmm. Second of all, as you point out, pretty young.
Yeah.
I would say they do a good job following rules. Would you say that's an accurate statement?
I would say that's pretty accurate. Yeah.
They're not like the type of people who are gonna they're not like people who are going to go out and burn down government buildings because they don't like a policy. They're going to argue with it. And they're going to say what they believe, but they're not going to do that.
They're not activists.
Yeah, they're not and I think that's I mean that in a good way in this particular measure specifically. And then also there are people who tend to do a lot of thinking about others. Right? They're much, I would say, less focused on well, damn it, it's my right, than, you know what? I don't like this, but I don't want to make anyone else sick. I want to make sure that I think there's a very selfless aspect of that culture that makes a state like Utah perform really well. And I will note too, number 4 was Idaho.
Yes, also quite Mormon.
Mm-hmm. And that it's an interesting thing, and I think that it comes down to that a little bit more than cable news and even talk shows and politicians have talked about. You just mentioned this with the masks. The government policy has been such a factor, but really, I mean, you look at the states with no mask mandates and compare them to the ones with mask mandates. There's about a 10 to 12% difference of mask usage. It's really not that different.
Yeah.
It really doesn't make all that much difference. It's really about what the people wind up doing. We lead this government. They don't lead us.
So would this be a good time to send a couple of guys in white shirts and bicycles over to your house? Seems like a pretty good time maybe for that. I'll make the call. I'll make the call while you do the commercial.